All right. So welcome to, as I said, our CCE Flock Talks, Brooding and Rearing Basics lecture, Introduction to Waterfowl. My name is Amy Barkley. I'm the Livestock and Beginning Farm Specialist with the Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops Program. I cover a 5-county region in Southwest New York, and I am more than happy to answer any questions about anything pertaining to waterfowl from this presentation. But if you have any other questions, there are other specialists across the state who are able to help you. Two of those educators are on with us tonight, this morning rather, I guess this afternoon. We have Lynn Bliven here from CCE Allegheny and Michelle Proscia from CCE Sullivan. Lynn is going to help me with the chat box and with moderating things. So thank you, Lynn. My work with waterfowl has been, I was raised on a small family farm in northeastern Pennsylvania. I've bred and hatched waterfowl and grown waterfowl up for egg production through that time. And I've worked on and off with waterfowl through my educational program at Penn State while I pursued my degree in animal science. And now I have a small family farm where we raise heritage poultry, which has recently included some waterfowl, including geese and ducks. So today's class schedule is going to look a little bit like this. We're going to start with breed selection and then get into managing brooders. And then we're going to touch really lightly on nutrition and housing basics. It's going to be a mile-high overview. I don't want to get into the weeds too much. There's a lot to know, but this is just an introductory lecture. If you have any further questions, you can go ahead and contact me. And it'll be the same thing for egg and meat production concepts. Why waterfowl is the first question that I want to ask. So waterfowl are neat because they can provide a diversification of farm income through various means. They can be raised for meat, they can be raised for eggs, or they can be integrated into a larger management system on the farm for integrated pest management purposes, such as ducks eating eating snails off of mushrooms if you have a log-grown mushroom operation, or perhaps these animals can be run in the vineyard to eat slugs and other bugs, depending on what your operation looks like and if you're set up for that. And geese can actually be used as grazers, and they can be integrated into a rotational grazing system to follow other species around. Ducks can also be used to do that, and they are regularly used as species which precede sheep and goats to help prevent meningeal worm. Let's first talk about the different breeds and varieties of waterfowl that we can have here in Southwest New York and beyond. So the first that I want to cover is meat ducks. Meat ducks can technically be any duck, but there are some breeds of meat ducks which have been bred purposely for fast growth and high rates of gain. Those are the improved pekins. Typically, they're called a hybrid pekin, and they are sold by a lot of the major hatcheries here in the United States. There's also a standard pekin, which is more of a heritage breed. It grows about as fast, doesn't produce as much meat, but is still regularly used as a meat animal, sometimes as a dual purpose animal. A Rouen, which you'll see the picture on the bottom right there, which is essentially a larger Muscovy, and a larger mallard, and an Ellsbury, which is very similar to a pekin, which is the picture on the upper right. It's another heritage breed. These birds are water loving, and they don't need water, but they really like water. And in terms of hatchability, if you're going to hatch your own, they take 28 days to hatch, and that's the standard hatch rate for a mallard descendant type duck. These ducks have the fattiest meat of any of the poultry that we can produce on our farms. And as I said, some of these breeds can be useful as dual purpose critters. When we look at the laying ducks, they're kind of another realm of their own. So like with chickens, how we have Cornish and then we have layer birds for your meat and your eggs, we have very similar differentiations in our duck breeds. There are hybrid layers that are produced by different hatcheries. They come under different names, but they will produce the highest number of eggs for you. And then in terms of heritage breeds, khaki Campbells are probably going to be your best egg producing birds. They're going to lay somewhere between 200 and 290 eggs a year, very similar to a chicken, a little lower, but the eggs are larger. Their feed conversion is about the same, so people like them for that. If you're interested in raising other duck breeds, they can be good layers too. Not as good as some of the hybrid layers, but 130 to 200 eggs a year isn't too bad. They're going to be lighter bodied. They're not going to have as many leg problems during their grow out. They're going to be more mobile. They're typically a little bit more flighty. They'll move around a lot more, but these animals are also water loving. And even though they are lighter bodied, can be dual purpose. You can raise the males up for meat if you want, though they do take a longer maturation time, and the females for eggs. And like the meat breed ducks, because they're descended from mallards, they take 28 days to hatch. Muscovies are strange. A lot of people like Muscovies. They are actually a wood duck. They're not related to all of the other ducks that I've mentioned previously, which are descendants of the mallard. These are descendants of another species, essentially. So they can fly. They will roost. Some people find them up on their roofs. They'll roost in roosts with chickens. They're kind of weird. They don't really quack super loud. They kind of have a muffled whisper when they make noise, and they hiss. So they're really quiet if you want a quieter animal on the farm or homestead. They're also sexually dimorphic, meaning that the females are much, much smaller than the males, and you can very easily tell males from females early on in the grow out, somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks of age. Because these are a different species, they're going to take about 35 days to incubate, which is a week longer than our other duck eggs. And these birds are famous for going broody and famous for hatching almost anything. Nothing really beats the mothering of a Muscovy duck. As you can see in this image, this duck has probably 15 babies that she's herding around, and she's quite happy to be in that role. Muscovies are typically raised for meat. They can be raised as companion animals, but also meat, and their meat has less fat than other ducks, and they also have a larger proportion of breast meat and less fat. And as I mentioned, females can go broody. Then there's this thing called the mule duck, or called a mulard. And that's a combination of a mallard type duck crossed with a Muscovy. Because they're two separate types of ducks, they're going to breed, and that's going to be fine, but the offspring that they produce are going to be sterile. So those offspring, when they lay eggs, those eggs will not hatch. These birds are typically used for meat or foie gras production, and they are kind of the best of both worlds. Because the line breeding has been bred out of them, because you're breeding two different critters together from different genetic lines, you're going to get hybrid vigor, so faster growth, better growth, less health issues. When you cross these animals together, what's going to happen is that your hatch rate is going to be typically lower than a regular duck hatch rate. The fertility is just going to be lower. But you know, this is a very common practice to do in other parts of the world, especially. Typical cross is a Pekin plus a Muscovy, because it's a meat breed plus a meat breed, and that gives an offspring with characteristics that are good for meat production. Because these are cross also, they are about 32 days till hatch, which is somewhere in the middle between a Pekin and a Muscovy. They have claws like a Muscovy. They don't roost, they don't fly, but they do like to swim. So a little bit of both right there. Now let's talk about geese. Geese don't have as much variety within the species, but they are readily used on the farm or homestead. They can be used as weeders, they can be used for meat, specialty egg production. You could be selling goslings, and you can also use them as a rotation with other grazing livestock. They have various body types, sizes, temperaments, and noise capacities. So I'm going to give you two extremes. So on the one side, perhaps we have a Roman goose, which is an endangered heritage breed. This breed is very, very calm, smaller bodied, quiet, generally calm, and not super aggressive. On the other side, you can have Chinese geese, which are a little more high strung. They're taller bodied, smaller bodied, and they are so noisy, but they're really good for weeders. So the Romans are maybe better for meat. The Chinese are good for weeders, but across the spectrum, geese kind of fall into these different categories. They are really poor layers though. So if you want to either hatch eggs or have eggs for Pizanki, or maybe if you're selling them as a delicacy for eating, they're only going to lay between 13 and 55 eggs a year, sometimes only one clutch, especially if you allow them to set. They're not going to hatch multiple clutches a year. They typically start in early spring around, well, late winter, I'll say they start laying around here, and into early spring before they stop for the season. And these birds take about 28 days till hatch. All right, so now that we have our species and breeds kind of outlined, let's get into managing the brooder space for these little guys. When you're preparing a brooder, it's going to be very, very similar to preparing a chick brooder. You're going to need to prepare it ahead of time, and what you'll need is an area to confine the birds, a bedding source that's going to be either straw or wood shavings, kiln dried, a lighter heat source, a waterfowl appropriate starter feed, and we're going to get into that in a little bit, and plenty of water. These animals absolutely love and need water. When we think about brooder space, it needs to be large enough to accommodate the young birds, the water, the feeder, and the light. You need to have enough room for those birds to move about the brooder freely, and if they need to get out from under the light, they can. And you don't want to force them to eat or drink right under the light where they might be too warm. And you want enough space so that they don't pile on each other either. Typically, you're going to start with about 1/3 square foot per bird initially, and then that space increases rapidly as these birds grow. As we'll see in a slide further on down the line, these birds grow incredibly fast. They put on body size like nobody's business. So you'll need to watch them carefully and increase the brooder space as needed. The floor of the brooder, because these birds have a propensity to slip around and might get splay leg, you'll want to have either wood shavings or straw as a substrate on that floor to stop them from succumbing to those issues. And the wood shavings and straw also act somewhat as an absorbency pad because these animals poop a lot of water. They poop about 90% water. And so that needs to be accounted for and taken out with the bedding material. With these animals, with the bedding, it'll need to be changed frequently. And we'll get into that in a second. But this is a brooder that I have for our waterfowl at our farm. It is a 32 square foot brooder, and realistically, according to the recommendations, you could put up to 96 ducklings or 60 goslings in that initially. But if you already look into that brooder space, there are 2 goslings in there that are a day of age, and they're pretty big. I really can't imagine having 60 goslings in there for any long period of time, maybe for the first week, but this is where you should have more brooder space than you need and constantly watch to make sure that your space is sufficient. This is a typical brooder setup. It doesn't have to be a box. It could be a brooder ring in a barn. It could be a cardboard box if it's large enough to accommodate the birds. It could be a stock water tote, for instance. But what you'll want is you'll want to have your feed and water away from your heat source so that the birds have the option of going away from the light to eat and drink. The feed and water should be close to each other with the waterfowl because they tend to shovel their food. If you've ever watched them, they kind of go at their food, shovel it, and then try to shovel it down. And they need that water to rinse that food down their throats, or else they might succumb to choking. With the water, you'll want to provide warm water for the first 3 weeks of age because anything cooler might chill their little bodies. And when you first get them onto your farm, it's a good idea to provide vitamins and trace minerals in the water at the rate recommended by the packaging in order to help overcome the effects of stress either from shipping or from being in a farm store prior to you picking them up. One of the recommendations for water for ducks is to have your watering vessel set on a wire platform with a catch basin underneath. And the reason for that is ducks have a tendency to play in their water. And I'll actually play this video here. We used a cat bowl. They're, I think, 3 days old in this video, but they just splash around. They're not thirsty. They just want to have fun. And they will splash water everywhere in the brooder and make it a real big mess real fast. So in order to help decrease that messing capacity, having the water in a separate space where there's a catch basin underneath can help catch some of that excess water that they splash around. Light can be either white or red if you're using light. I don't think there are brooder plates that will accommodate ducks and goslings for very long, maybe for the first week, but it's really difficult to raise those up because they are limited in their height, and ducks and goslings grow really, really fast. So you'll likely have a heat lamp on them. And the bulb choices that you can choose are either white or red light. Typically with chicks, game bird chicks, chicken chicks, turkey chicks, you'll want to have a red light because that can decrease pecking. But with ducks, they really don't peck and attack each other. They more push each other around when they're feeling stressed and don't have a lot of space. So either white light or red light will work for these guys. Typically the light bulb intensity that you want to get is a 250 watt light bulb. These are sold in a variety of spaces, and because they are 250 watts, not only do they provide heat or light, but they also provide heat. As we think about managing our brooder temperatures, we want to decrease that temperature. Well, we want to start at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and we want to decrease the temperature by 5 degrees a week until the birds hit about 7 weeks of age, where they can, or 5 weeks of age, sorry, where they can be pulled off the heat during the day and the night. So we decrease the temperature in our brooder by raising the heat lamp typically. If it's a really nice day outside, those birds can maybe go outside for some time where they're in the sunlight, where they can stay warm, and then they can come back in. If you're doing that kind of an operation where you do have the birds going out before they are fully acclimated, just make sure that they have a place to get out of the sun and make sure that they're warm enough. Just pay attention, make sure they're not shivering, and they should be okay. By the time they're 7 to 9 weeks old, they're going to be well acclimated, they'll be mostly feathered, and they can go outside without issue both day or night. But before then, it's good to bring them in at night into a sheltered environment where they're able to relax and do well without the stress of not having enough heat. This is a chick comfort chart. It's used for any type of fowl, and typically what you'll see is if the birds are comfortable, they will be evenly dispersed throughout the brooder, some under the light, some in a ring around the light, maybe 1 or 2 under, maybe a couple in the corner, but they'll be pretty evenly dispersed. And so that's the picture on the top left there. If they're too cold, they're all going to huddle under the light. And if it's too hot, they're all going to be away from the light. And that's a very simple way to determine if your temperatures are too hot or too cold, and you can adjust your light height accordingly. I like to throw this in here because heat lamps are dangerous. You have a bulb that's exposed to a lot of flammable things, down, bedding, wood, and I would like to make sure that if you're choosing to go with a heat lamp, that you choose one that is safe for you and to use it safely. So in the picture on the right-hand side, we have 3 types of heat lamps. This is from an article by Cornell Small Farms about managing heat light risk. And these lamps are rated on the left-hand side from least safe, which is one of the older styles that you could buy from a farm supply store, all the way to the most safe on the right-hand side. Typically, a strong cord, a very thick cord, a ceramic base, and a cover for the light bulb itself are going to go a long way in ensuring safety. In addition, hanging that light off of a chain instead of baling twine is probably going to be a good idea in order to make sure it doesn't fall. Now with waterfowl, because they splash around in water so much, and as we know, if water hits a hot light bulb, the light bulb explodes, you want to make sure that your light source is away from your water source, so that if those birds splash around, that water has less of a chance to get onto that light bulb and cause it to explode, and therefore is less of a fire hazard. Always make sure that when you are attaching these lights that the cords are intact, that you're not running them off extension cords if you don't have to, and that the lamps are fully functioning before use. Swimming. Ducks love swimming. Do they need water to swim in? Not really. Do they love it? Absolutely. And a lot of folks want to get these birds out into water as early as possible. You can introduce ducklings to water and goslings to water as early as 1 week of age, but you need to be able to make sure they can get in and out freely so that they don't swim around and chill. And then a heat lamp should be nearby so that they can fluff up and dry off. By 5 to 6 weeks, they should be able to go into water without a heat lamp to dry off under if they are exposed to water early on. The early exposure to water allows them to mature their oil gland a little bit more, and so that'll help get their feathers all slicked up and nice so that they're more water resistant at an earlier age. So let's talk about nutrition basics. If you've never had waterfowl before, I just wanted to show you kind of how quickly they grow. These are a couple of geese that we got in last year, and on May 20th, they came in the box from California, and by June 10th, which was about, 20 days later, they were just massive. And then by July 10th, they essentially hit their full body size. So these critters grow really, really fast, but they're really slow maturing. If you're looking for ducks to lay eggs, they're not going to lay eggs until about 6 or 7 months of age. And if you're looking for geese to reproduce, it's going to take about a year for them to become sexually mature enough so that they can produce viable offspring. When we talk about food needs, of course, water is paramount. Nothing happens without water. Even though ducks and geese, well, ducks more so than geese, waste a lot of water, it's really, really important that they always have access to it in some capacity. I always say that ducks are mostly water, so having that nearby is really good for them. When you provide them feed for their age and stage of life. Usually you'll start with a starter or starter grower for the first, probably 8 weeks or so. And then if you have meat birds, you're probably going to give them a finisher starting at 5 weeks. If you have layer birds, you're probably going to give them a laying feed, probably around 5 months or so, just before they start to lay. One of the important things I want to make note of is that these feeds must be nutritionally complete. And by that, I mean they can't just be scratch grains, they can't just be a grain combination, they can't just be corn. They need to be a feed that has been developed by a poultry nutritionist. This allows for the most accurate vitamin and trace mineral content to allow for the best growth. And this is especially important for their legs, which we'll talk about in a second. If you don't have access to a waterfowl formulated feed, that's okay. We understand that there are some farm supply stores that just don't sell it, and that's fine. We don't want you to drive hours out of your way to pick up a waterfowl specific feed. So if all that's available to you is a chicken feed with similar nutrition, that is fine. You can use that. Generally, for a feed nutrient content, you're going to want about a 22% protein per starter. So again, that's either to 5 weeks for your meat type birds or till about 5 months for your egg type birds. And then if you're either going to a finishing diet or a holding laying diet, holding meaning your birds are just kind of hanging out, they're not producing meat or eggs for you, those protein recommendations of 18 to 20% or 14 to 16% are what you're going to want to target. Typically, more protein is okay. For layers, more protein will end up with larger eggs. But generally speaking, more protein, if it's more than the bird needs, it's just going to poop it out. So it's not going to utilize that protein, and it's not necessarily worth the money to spend extra on a higher protein feed if you don't need it. The second thing I want to bring to your attention, very similar to chickens, is the calcium to phosphorus ratio. You'll want that to approach a 2 to 1 for young and growing birds. And that's going to be between about 3/4 and 1% calcium during that starter grower phase. Once those birds get to laying, you can then feed them a feed with 3% calcium. This is a lot higher. The phosphorus to calcium ratio is much different, but it'll ensure that the bird is building up her bone stores enough so that she can produce eggs with strong shells. Once those birds are done laying, they can go back onto a holding diet with a lower calcium to phosphorus ratio. Sometimes we get questions of how much feed should I feed my birds? They're out, they're foraging in the pastures or in my backyard. Do I need to give them food? And the answer is still yes. They need to be provided a complete feed at all times, and the pasture should be considered a supplement. The only exception for this is birds that have been trained to work in either vineyards or in pastures to control slug and snail populations, or geese who are raised on pasture that is young and lush and exclusively part of their diet. Those birds can get a fully formulated feed as a supplement rather than their primary diet. But generally speaking, you'll want to provide these animals with a complete diet throughout their whole lifespan. They do have a good ability to use fiber, geese especially. You'll notice if you have your geese out free ranging, they will eat a ton of grass. They've always got their heads in the grass, picking up the tender shoots. And their feces, if you'll notice at the other end, is mostly green grass. So because grass is not super nutrient dense, they have to eat a ton of it. So always have a good amount of grass available for those animals, should that be your feeding style. Oh, and one of the things I wanted to mention was the SARE project. I'm going to put up my highlighter here so you can see where I'm talking. This SARE project was completed a couple of years ago. And what they found is that if you limit grain feeding to 2 feedings per day in geese that are being grown for market weight, It provides satisfactory gain, taste, and texture of the final product because they're gleaning most of their nutrition from pasture. So if you want to read more, the link's here. That'll come in the notes, which I will provide at the end of this presentation. Niacin. There's a lot of buzz about niacin. Niacin is vitamin B3 and is essential to the proper leg growth and development of waterfowl. Especially in those first 10 weeks, those waterfowl need a higher amount of niacin, about 2 to 3 times more, than their chicken or turkey counterparts. Once they're mature, they really don't need this niacin. About 90% of the leg issues that you would see in your flock are going to happen before those animals are mature if they are not fed enough niacin. And so that leads the question, how do you supplement this? Now, most feeds are going to provide enough niacin for ducks and geese. And the way that you're gonna verify that is look at the tag. So this is a Do More tag. This is a feed that's readily available in farm supply stores, tractor supply stores across the country. And it very specifically says for starting chickens, ducks, geese, and for growing chickens, ducks, geese, turkey, quail, chukar, and pheasant. So waterfowl are included in there, which means they've added extra niacin to accommodate for those folks who are either not have access to a waterfowl feed or have a mixed flock and are they want to feed one feed. So check your feed tag, make sure it's good for waterfowl. That's typically called all flock feed. Sometimes this particular one is chick starter crumble. So just take a look at the feed tags to verify and figure out which one you'd like. And as I said, many of the name brand chick feeds do have enough nutrition to satisfy the requirements for waterfowl. Now, if you happen to be getting a feed either from a local mill that may not be adding enough niacin, if you ask them, they'll be able to tell you. You can supply, or if you're getting a feed that doesn't have enough niacin in it, just a commercial off-the-shelf feed, you can supplement niacin either with capsules, liquid niacin, or brewer's yeast. And each of those supplements is going to have a different level of niacin in it. If you're curious about how to calculate how much niacin to add to your feed or water, this blog post by Metzer Farms here at the bottom is going to tell you the step-by-step instructions of how to calculate that. Vitamins and electrolytes are often used in poultry rearing. I talk about these because these are chick Gatorade. They help overcome the stresses of shipping, which we talked about earlier, stresses of movement, or things like that. The rate that you are going to provide them is going to be listed on the package. Don't go over that rate. This is where too much of a good thing is a bad thing. It'll create an adverse taste in the water and it could throw off their mineral balance. They might not drink the water. So just add it to the level that's recommended on the package if you're going to add it. Probiotics are now being more and more commonplace in feed products and supplements. And essentially what they are is they are living bacteria that shift gut microbiota to more favorable species. And so what happens is by putting more of these favorable gut bacteria in the gut of the bird, they're going to outcompete the bad stuff that might be coming into the bird through its environment. So these are more of a preventative measure. They're not going to cure anything and they're not going to be harmful for the animal. Now, if you're thinking about adding these, you can go ahead and pick up a package, make sure it's good for waterfowl, and add it at the appropriate rate. There are some feeds that already have it in it. Again, the Do More chick crumble that we talked about earlier has that in it. And my only recommendation in here is if you're adding this to water, don't add it to water that may have apple cider vinegar in it because the apple cider vinegar will kill the bacteria that you're trying to get into the bird's gut. And this is just a close-up of the two images that I have. So the first is a vitamin and electrolyte with lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is this is your probiotic right here. And then in this Do More Chick Starters, same tag I had last time, which is good for waterfowl. You have total microorganisms, and it says you've got Bacillus subtilis and Bacillus coagulans. And those are two of the probiotics that are used commonly in poultry diets. So this feed already has probiotics in it. Okay. I bring up coccidiostats because there's a lot of questions around them. Can I feed them to waterfowl? Are they risked waterfowl? What can I feed if I can feed them? And the question of what they are also comes up. So what coccidiostats they're B vitamin inhibitors. They're not actually an antibiotic. They don't work to kill bacteria. What they do is they inhibit the coccidia, the little organism that causes coccidiosis. They inhibit that little organism's ability to absorb B vitamins. Doesn't hurt the bird, but hurts the bacteria or the little protozoan. That protozoan dies and is pushed out of the bird's digestive tract. Now, because it's not an antibiotic, there's no withdrawal from meat or eggs, so you don't have to worry about that. The most common coccidiostat that's included in feed is called amprolium. And this feed tag up here, oops, I thought I was going to have that red circled, and I didn't. I will just show it to you with the pointer here. So this is a turkey starter, and you can see, and they have to by law have it labeled if it has medication in it or not. This contains AMP, which is short for amprolium at 0.0125%. It's a medicated feed. So if you look through here on the feed tag, you'll be able to see if it's medicated or not. And generally speaking, these coccidiostats are not approved for use in waterfowl, so you will not see them on waterfowl specific feeds or feeds that are formulated for multiple species. But it's likely that they won't cause problems if you feed them or feed them by accident. Research by a group in 1983, I know it's a long time ago, but the research is still applicable, indicates that feeding ducklings a coccidiostat actually doesn't affect them if it's fed at the typical inclusion rate for chickens or turkeys. But the authors do say, unless it's absolutely necessary, do not feed coccidiostats to ducks or geese.
Amy, there was a question here. Cynthia asked,
Yeah.
Is this something which may have a restriction on purchasing?
No, there's no restriction on purchasing medicated feed. Yeah, if you're gonna go ahead and buy the medication separately, there might be a restriction because you can buy amprolium and then add it in to a feed. But if you're buying a feed already pre-produced, pre-packaged, there's no restriction on it. Okay. So let's jump into housing basics. As with all poultry, we want a clean and dry environment, protection from the sun and wind, ventilation so that we can exchange warm, moist air with cool air, protection from predators because, as we know, waterfowl are ground dwelling and super susceptible to predation, and we want to have food and water available at all times. If I had to tell you some other things that I'd really love to see in poultry housing but aren't essential to their success, they would be these items, which are rodent proofing, i.e. closing up any gaps that are larger than a quarter, enrichments to allow these animals to have some fun if they're locked up in a barn most of the day. Here in southwestern New York, our waterfowl are locked up for 7 months of the year because it is too snowy and too cold to let them out. So we provide them enrichment such as birdseed that they can search for in their bedding and other things like that. I have perch space here because this was stolen from a chicken presentation. We do not need perch space unless you have Muscovies, in which case they would probably appreciate having a perch or two to perch on. And for your nesting layer birds, you're going to want nests for them, nest boxes, but they're going to need to be on the ground rather than up because, as we know, ducks don't really jump. Air quality is super duper important. Poultry release a lot of moisture and ducks are so much worse than typical poultry in terms of that. As I said before, their poop contains 90% water, so that water has to go somewhere. Rather than staying in the bedding, it's better if it is picked up by incoming air and brought outside of the coop through a ventilation system, whether that be open air vents underneath your roof, whether it be a window, or whether it be a forced air system if you have a larger barn. So generally speaking, knowing whether or not your litter is too wet, if you're not squeamish, you can go ahead and reach down into your litter, grasp a bunch, squeeze it in your hand, and then let go. If it falls apart, you're okay. If it sticks together in a clump, you need to change something about your ventilation and or change out your bedding to be a drier bedding material. It just means the coop needs cleaning too. For space considerations, Metzer Farms, which does some of their own research onto waterfowl keeping, indicates that if you're keeping these animals in a barn, you're going to want about 4 square foot per bird. And I'm going to take that same recommendation and apply it to mobile coops as well. So if you're raising ducks in a chicken tractor, you're going to want to have about 4 square feet per bird, even if you're moving those birds regularly, simply because of just how messy they are. You want to reduce their capacity to step on their own wet manure and cause foot burns and dirty breast feathers and other issues like that. If these birds are being raised on range with no shelter, I would obviously recommend shelter, but this is just what they have in the Metzer Farms article there. You're going to want to aim for 50 square foot per bird, which is quite a lot of space per bird. Now, if you've got geese, just take those recommendations and double them. They're a bigger bodied animal and they need more space. I'm going to jump back to what I said a little bit earlier, where we don't want to have the foot pads of these birds touching wet manure a lot. That can lead to something called pododermatitis. Some folks also call it bumblefoot, but essentially what it is it's that the ducks' feet are very, very sensitive. They're more sensitive than chickens. They're less keratinized. And so what happens is when these ducks step on their own feces that's built up over time, or wet mud or what have you, what can happen is that the ammonia from that manure can actually cause a burn on the pad of their foot. And then over time, as they're stepping, that can cause an infection that can really hurt the bird. You'll notice limping typically with this. If you pick them up, you'll notice the callus on the bottom of the foot. Sometimes it'll be bleeding, sometimes it won't. Sometimes you'll also see it on the toe pads. So this is starting a little bit, but you can see it on each of the joints because those joints stick out and they are going to be in contact with the manure more so than the rest of the foot. So to prevent that, you'll want to keep bedding clean and dry a lot. And sometimes this can look like replacing bedding daily. For breeder operations, I've seen them replace bedding 3 times a day. Now, I don't recommend that you go and change your bedding 3 times a day. That's going to make you insane. But having a large enough area for your birds to go is going to decrease the amount of time you're going to need to replace bedding. The quote that I read is, if you double the size of your coop, you're going to decrease your bedding needs by 50%, just because the birds are spread out and their poop can dry out a little bit in between defecations, and that will allow for a drier environment overall and less chance of foot injury. Some people do raise waterfowl on slats or wire floors or in cages, but be careful here. Those materials can sometimes abrase the foot pad and cause injury that way. If you must have the birds up off the floor, or if you prefer them off the floor, what the recommendation is 1-inch vinyl coated mesh or galvanized metal for the slats for adults. Don't go with anything bigger because their feet are not going to withstand that super well. And you can sometimes have the best of both worlds, where you might have slat floor in one part of the coop and open floor in another part of the coop. So just weigh your pros and cons and what management style you want to go with and choose which one works best for you. And the question, do waterfowl need water? And yes, they need water. Do they need a ton of water? Maybe not. They need enough water at least to be able to submerge their whole head. They need to get their nostrils, they need to get their eyes in the water. And this is because of the way that a duck's facial system is kind of set up. And by being able to submerge their head, they're able to clear out their sinuses, clear out their eyes, and it helps them be healthier overall. The crusties that you sometimes see in the eyes of the birds can be remedied by providing them enough water to dunk their head in, making sure, of course, that it's clean. Water is also required for mating, especially for ducks. Geese, you might be able to get away with it a little bit, but ducks absolutely have to have that water for mating. Just the way their reproductive tract works, it needs to float. The male's reproductive tract needs to flow in the water and the female kind of needs to swim over it. Very interesting stuff. But what I'm saying here is that if you don't have water source for them to mate in, fertility is going to suffer, especially for the heavier breeds, like pecans, for instance. Ducks and geese, of course, love water for bathing, and it's enrichment for them too. They just like to splash around in it and run their bill in it and find whatever little living things they can pick out of it for food. So, do they need water? No. Do they need some water? Yes. Okay. All right. So I'm going to get into quickly some considerations for meat and egg production. This will take us through the end of the hour here. Again, this is a 30,000 foot overview. I'm not going to give you a whole ton of detail. If you'd like more information, you can reach out or explore more on your own with some of the resources here. So meat bird statistics. We're going to start with meat birds first. So if you're looking to raise looking to raise ducks for meat, you can choose from either the improved pecans, which are your hybrid meat birds, kind of like the Cornish cross equivalent in the chicken world. You can choose a heritage type meat bird, or you can choose a Muscovy bird. And those are going to mature at different ages. So your pecans improved are going to, I have 12 weeks here, but the reality is it's going to be more along the lines of, 7, 8 to 12 weeks. It depends on how large of a carcass you want. And if you take those birds out to 12 weeks, you're going to get a live weight that's about 9 to 11 pounds. And of course, when you process that bird, take 33% off of that, and that's going to be your carcass weight. So as we go down this list, we can see the different ages at harvest and the different live weights that you can produce. Typically with these animals, they have a higher fat diet because they lay down a lot of fat. The exception of this is, of course, the Muscovy. But when you are raising ducks for meat, a higher protein diet typically leads to a slightly leaner carcass, and a heavier energy diet typically leads to a fattier carcass. Muscovies, like I said, are the exception, where that's not going to change as much. And they're going to have larger breast meat. So probably, 5 or 10% more breast meat yield than a regular mallard descendant duck. And they're going to have less fat. Okay. So this is a chart from the Cornell University Duck Research Lab. And this chart is a lot, but it kind of dictates what these animals look like during their growth. This is for pecan ducks, per duck, mixed sexes, and you have your age in weeks here on the left-hand side and your live weight in pounds. So you can see how very rapidly these animals grow. In 2 weeks, they're almost 2 pounds live weight, which is just incredible. And over time, they're going to gain about 1 pound a week, and then efficiency is going to drop after week 7. Feed consumption per week is also going to go up, so that allows you to account for that if you're going to be raising pecans. The same with the water. And then it also tells you the manure output, which is super handy if you have birds in a confined space. So I'm not going to get into this too much. I'm going to leave this here for you to explore if you are interested in growing pecans. Now, processing considerations. Ducks are, as a rule of thumb, not as easy to process as chickens. The first issue is that they are water resistant, so plucking is difficult. And then they have a lot of pin feathers if you don't catch them in between molts. And that leads to a lot of time spent plucking ducks. Up to 3 to 4 times the amount of time you need to spend plucking a duck can happen if you have pins to contend with, as well as full feathers. So the goal always with ducks is to process in between molts. The table on the bottom right here, again, this is data from Metzer Farms, indicates the opportunities for plucking both ducks and geese in between their molting times. So the first opportunity is 7 weeks for ducks, 9 weeks for geese, and goes through opportunity 2 and then opportunity 3. So that's just something to consider. Some folks, to some it doesn't matter if they are plucking them. They don't really care for the skin. So they'll just go ahead and skin the bird. That is an option, but there is value in that fat, especially if you're selling to retail establishments such as restaurants, or folks that just like duck to saute up. Typically they want that high fat content, or the high fat, there's fat under the skin, and they want that fat under the skin in order to render it off, both for further cooking and to add flavor to the duck breast that they're cooking. When you pluck geese and ducks, you can choose either to wet pluck, where you dunk the bird in water and then wait until the feathers release and then pull them out, or dry pluck, where it's like making a feather mattress. You're just pulling all the feathers off of the duck that's already been killed and bled. And that's a way to do it too. But once you do that, you will probably need to wax the bird, either that or pick all the pin feathers out individually with the pliers. And waxing is a technique where you can go ahead, dip the bird in wax and water, lift it out, let the wax dry, peel the wax off. It's like waxing your legs, for instance. It just takes out all the pin feathers, which is super nice. Sometimes you gotta do it 1 or 2 times in order to make it effective, but it'll generally lead to a prettier carcass if you're going to sell it. In terms of yields, we're looking at about 70% of the live weight if you're going to sell with the giblets. If you're going to sell without, it's about 63%. And then with ducks, about 30%. Well, so I don't have geese listed here because we're typically selling geese as whole carcasses. I have not yet seen geese parted out and sold that way. So for ducks, note that about 30% of the weight of the carcass is in fat and skin. And that is just an incredible amount of fat, which is a result of the higher energy diet typically. You can flex that a little bit, but these birds are genetically predisposed to building up that fat because they're descended from a migratory bird. They need to build up fat typically to migrate. So that's why we have so much fat on those birds. Now, in terms of breast meat, like I said before, Muscovies are going to have, 5 to 10% more over a mallard type bird. And that's why, and the breast meat is just going to be heavier per breast and is more typical of what restaurants are looking for. All right, we're going to jump into a little bit of egg considerations. Now, these are just the numbers that I had on my previous slide way back in the beginning here, where we have the hybrid layers and khaki Campbells being the best layers, other ducks being good layers, and geese being abysmal layers, only laying in the early spring. Duck eggs are kind of cool because they're unique. Geese eggs are going to be big and white, but duck eggs have a little bit of variation to them. Duck eggs can be white, but they can also be blue or green tinted. And in the case of some breeds like the Cayuga, they can be almost black. They're not going to be perfectly tinted, especially the black ones, because that bloom, so the coloration that's on that egg, can be scrubbed off during the washing process. So they'll look a little bit bedraggled there, but a lot of folks like the uniqueness of the dark color of the Cayuga eggs. And then in this picture on the bottom, these are some black runner eggs, and it might be difficult to see on your screen, but there are some white ones, which I'm now highlighting with my pointer, and then some more green ones, which I'm now highlighting with my pointer. So ducks can lay a variety. And when we consider egg production, I want to also consider male to female ratios. And if you're keeping ducks as pets, we also need to really strongly consider male to female ratios. And this is because male waterfowl, ducks especially, tend to be very aggressive towards females. They just want to mate them all the time. And this can lead to harassment such that they stop laying eggs because they don't want to get on the floor. It can lead to reduced growth rates in females and reduced onset of egg production because these females are too afraid to get down to eat because they don't want to be assaulted by the males. So it's a really good idea to have a duck ratio of around 1 to 5. If you have a smaller flock and you are afraid that you might lose a male to a predator, for instance, you might have maybe 2 males in your flock, but typically you want to stay around that 1 to 5 ratio. Geese are a little different. They sometimes mate for life, and so 1 to 1 is good. If you have a larger breeding operation, perhaps you want to go 1 male for every up to 4 geese. It's up to you what works for you. You can tell fertility, of course, by incubating the eggs and seeing what forms, or by cracking them and checking them out. I can tell you a little bit more about that if you're interested. But generally speaking, those are the ratios that you want to have. Nest boxes for waterfowl have to be at ground level, with the exception of Muscovies, which may be able to get up into higher nest boxes. But these boxes need to be large enough to accommodate the duck or goose while sitting. Can't be too low. They need to be able to get their head in there and sit in there comfortably. These nest boxes should be deeply bedded because these animals have a tendency to dig out a spot to sit, lay their egg, and then push the material back over the egg and hide them. So when you're looking for eggs, if you don't see them immediately on the top of the nest, you can go ahead and dig down and pick out the eggs that way. They're probably hidden under there. With waterfowl, cleanliness of their environment is key to clean and wholesome eggs. In New York State, to sell eggs, they don't have to be washed. But with waterfowl, because they have a tendency to be so dirty, I would consider washing them. They do have to be refrigerated though. So, but anyway, back to the cleanliness portion. If you keep your bedding relatively clean and you keep your nest box bedding clean, that's going to go a long way to keeping those eggs clean. Training the hens to nest boxes early can help with what's called floor-laid eggs or mislaid eggs. Ducks and geese, not so much, but ducks are notorious for just waddling around and plopping an egg wherever they feel like it, whether they be out in the run or out in the field or by the food bowl. And to help reduce that risk, placing nest boxes in their coop early, making them really attractive, is going to help train those hens to lay in that nest box. Quiet, dark, secluded corners are best. They're shy layers. So putting the nest box right by the door where you access the pen to feed and water and check on the birds is probably not going to be the most attractive for her to lay in. If you have some issues with birds that are laying eggs where they shouldn't be laying eggs, you can go ahead and lock those birds in the barn until late morning when most of the eggs will be laid. And of course, always pick up mislaid eggs as soon as possible. Following collection, eggs need to be refrigerated. New York state and federal guidelines recommend collecting them and refrigerating them within 48 hours of lay. If you have a drake or a gander in your flock, it might be a good idea to go ahead and get those collected every 24 hours in order to impede development and keep egg quality high. Once refrigerated, eggs cannot be kept at room temperature. This is just a general rule of thumb, with the only exception being you can refrigerate them, pull them out to wash them, and then put them back into refrigeration. Just because when you take an egg from a cold environment to a warm environment, it can result in the penetration of bacteria. Okay, I know that was a 30,000-foot overview of production of waterfowl, but at this point, I would welcome any further questions, comments, or if you have a couple of stories that you want to share, open for that too. And I'll leave up to 10 minutes for discussion, so I will sign off here at 1:10. Lynn, do we have any questions?
Yeah, I did miss one on cyanobacteria that Cynthia had. She said being waterfowl is summertime and impacts of climate change and more cyanobacteria growth. Is there anything in relation to waterfowl that can be done to prevent toxic environment?
I don't know enough about that to speak to that. Do you know anything, Lynn or Michelle? I know you're on the call. Do you have anything to offer? If not, what I'll do, Cynthia, is I will look into that and get back to you.
Aeration and water flow helps with.
Right.
I'm assuming,
right.
Cynthia, you're talking about blue-green algae growth on your pond, or are you having other? Is there other specific things that? And at this point, folks can. Oh, okay, yes. So yeah, with the algae growth, water movement, so stagnation is a problem. But yeah, it can be challenging with the changes in the temperature. So if you have a pond, aeration can sometimes help with that, and or if you can control the input. But again, a lot of us use mainly surface runoff, so it's a little bit harder to control.
Right. And with waterfowl, they're adding their nutrients to the water every time they swim. So in that case, maybe it might be important to look even more closely at aeration or other techniques to replace that water in order to reduce the nutrients for cyanobacteria growth.
Yeah, that's true. Another question she has is if it is a dark color, that means a cooler for duck environment so they don't overheat while nesting. I'm not exactly sure, Cynthia, if you're talking about the housing, closing it in for, maybe you can expand on what we're asking there about nesting. And or feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly if you have mic. Oh, so housing, do ducks overheat when nesting?
I would say probably not, as long as you have good airflow through your coop and the coop temperature remains probably below 75, 80 degrees. There shouldn't be a problem with overheating. Just monitor your ducks. If they're panting really hard, just make sure they have a lot of water nearby. Heat stress is going to happen to any fowl, regardless of what they are, or if they're laying, or if they're cockerels just running around. So just monitoring their temperatures as closely as you can, increasing ventilation if you have that capacity in your barn, if you see some signs of overheating, and providing water are the best management strategies for that.
So that's what I have in the chat box. I guess, again, if anybody wants to ask specific questions, feel free to unmute yourself. So Anne asked, does CCE have any blueprints for duck housing?
So I will answer and then I'll let Lynn chime in. I'm not aware of blueprints for CCE, but I know the University of, I believe, Nebraska has a really good set of plans. I'm gonna stop my share real quick so that we can all see each other. And I'm gonna go pull that up so that I will be able to put that in the references. So when I send out this presentation, I think what's going to be easier, when I send out this presentation, I will send that link to different housing building plans.
I am not aware of any. There is some information more general on duck research through the Duck Research Lab at Cornell, but I don't recall anything specifically. Unless there's an individual CCE organization that has some. Another question here, in raising farm poultry, should ducks and geese be kept separate from other fowl species?
So if I put on my poultry health hat right now, I will say yes, you should always keep waterfowl separate from other fowl, simply because waterfowl are transmitters of diseases that are not going to harm them, but will cause issues in your flock. Things such as avian influenza, and that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head, but I know that there are others that don't show illness in waterfowl, but they will show illness in chickens and turkeys. Therefore, the recommendation is, if you can, keep them in a separate building, keep them in a separate pasture, and try to keep your footwear and care clothing separate for each of them. From another perspective, if you look at brooding, you don't want to brood waterfowl with other fowl, because waterfowl just grow so fast and they are so aggressive with the water and they make the brooders so wet. It's not really good for other fowl to be raised with them, so they should be brooded separately.
So I did add the link from the Duck Lab on housing, but it's just the general overview. There isn't any blueprints.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I'm not 100% sure that this university website that I'm going to send has blueprints for duck houses, but I know that there is about 20 blueprints on there. And so I'm sure that there's at least something that can be modified for duck housing.
Great.
Okay. Well, if you guys think of any other questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm going to pop that into the chat.
And we did have a couple of folks that came on late, just so you know that it's being recorded and the recording will also be shared with you.
Yep. Yeah, so I plan to get that recording out probably tomorrow, if all goes well and my schedule doesn't conflict too much. Otherwise, you'll see it by the end of the week. Oh,
Cynthia, go ahead. If you'd like to ask a question, go ahead.
In the summertime, excuse me, in the summertime, when you have flocks and you have the different gnats and things like that, what can you use to keep down the gnats so that they aren't affected by, just the biting and the aggravation, such?
Right. So I don't know necessarily that there are any approved pesticides to use. There might be some essential oils, not entirely sure. I can ask our IPM folks to see if they know. But the general recommendation that I'm familiar with is, if it's in the summer and there's a lot of gnats, to put a gnat type screen, like window screen, around the coop entrance, or like the windows and any of the ventilation areas and any areas where air can move through, where gnats can move through, and then just keep the birds inside for that time period until the gnat population passes. But I understand that that's sometimes not possible, and it might not be great for the birds in terms of heat stress, especially if you live in a warmer environment. So I'll check into that and I'll let you know. Where, Cynthia, if you don't mind me asking, where have you been having issues with gnats?
Actually, I work for Kentucky State University, and I get with farmers. So if they have issues, I try and have information passed along with them.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and you asked about ticks as well. I saw that comment just pop in. I don't think ticks are an issue. Again, that's another thing. I'm not an IPM specialist, so I'll check into that and let you know. Thank you for those. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, like I said, you can go ahead and email me with any questions you may have, and I will do my best to answer them. If not, I will send them to somebody who can. Thank you so much for attending today. This has been really, really fun. It's great to talk about waterfowl and all the fun that they are. So thanks again. Have a good rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you later.
Miss Amy,
Yeah.
will we get a notification on when the recording would be available?
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll send it directly to your email. Yeah, as well as a copy of the notes.
Thanks, Amy. That was great.
Yep. All right, Lynn, thank you so much for hanging on, and thank you, Michelle, as well.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, I'll stop.